Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this video. In this video I will talk about debt and psychologically and how debt sort of plays a role in the Jungian paradigm, but then also, I guess, to a large extent my own interpretation of the sort of the ego structure and the ego's fundamental entanglement with the other via the notion of the logic of debt. Please, if you like this video and if you like the content on this channel in general, then consider subscribing and recommending these videos to other people. Consider liking and do leave your comment if you want to see other content or other videos, if you have questions and comments, and I'll do my best to respond to everything. Okay, debt. So we have talked in other videos about the structure of the ego in terms of the linearity it creates. So essentially, if we think about the ego from a Jungian perspective, it's different from the sort of content that is situated within the subject personality as a whole. So what I think I am and what that me entails in terms of the experiences and whatever happened to me, that's different from what I think I am in terms of what I present to myself and to others. So you can think of this as a country in its complexity and its multifaceted sort of aspects versus what is communicated about the country by its ambassadors and its, even if I function as ambassador, if I travel abroad and I'll talk to someone and I'll go like, oh yeah, Germany, this is Germany and blah, blah, blah. That's different from what the country actually is and entails as a whole, right? And again, it's also different from what you as an external viewer will think of the country. So you have these different stakeholders that sort of come together in forming or shaping what the actual country is. So if you take the country in its infinite complexity as a whole, right, at the core, and you have on the one hand the members of the country, or let's call them ambassadors, going around communicating what it is, and then you have other people thinking something about the country, so having an opinion or judgment, and then you have yourself as also just another person forming a judgment of the country. And so even if you are one of these ambassadors and you communicate a certain image, a certain story about the country, you're also inhabiting the function of another person that has a certain opinion of the country itself. And that may differ from whatever you communicate, right? And this is quite simple. If you think about, let's, for example, think about a very basic example, right? And this very much touches upon the question, like, what is truth in the end, which we don't want to touch upon because that's sort of complex. But if you think about the question, how do you communicate your, let's say you have one of these new agey jobs. It's like you're a consultant and you're trying to tell your parents that are in their 70s about what you're doing. And let's assume your parents have some kind of conservative job, they're an administrator, a politician, administrator, no, maybe not a politician, but let's say a nurse, your parents are nurses or doctors, and then it's conservative jobs that have nothing to do with the corporate world in essence. And so you'll attempt to sort of communicate, you'll like, yeah, consulting, what you do is you have these complex problems that companies have, you try to analyze them and try to solve them, and that's what you do. And they're like, okay, well, you do that all day long, or what exactly are you doing? And you're like, yeah, I'm building slides, PowerPoint presentations to present these complex issues to stakeholders. And they're like, okay, so you're building slides. Great, that's an interesting job. And then it'll be, so you'll try to communicate something, but the reality of it is so much different. And first of all, the reality is different, right? Like, what you know about the job, the image you have of the job is different because it's tainted with all these multifaceted sort of elements. But then the job itself is also vastly different. And this doesn't mean, it's not a sort of Kantian argument where I'm saying that you don't have access to sort of the job in itself, right? Sure, like the job in itself, of the form of the job, if you will, okay, that's different. But even the reality of the entirety of the job, right? It's different from what you communicate about it to others, and and that is again different from what you know about it, right? Simply by the nature of communication, okay? So now going away from these sort of more abstract examples, let's move towards sort of the ego, right? What does it have to do with the ego? The point is that your ego, or let's say your subjectivity, your person as a whole, your psyche as a whole, your personality, if you will, as a whole. Personality not as a term, but just as a way to describe the unconscious and conscious elements that make up what you are. And by that, I specifically mean, you know, one way to think about this metaphorically, the spatial metaphor, you think about this in terms of this bookshelf behind me, right? You have a lot of books, right? These books have contents and they're clustered into shelves, right? So the books themselves, Jung would call complexes. So they're psychological complexes. They're units, if you will, of meaning that around which or in which content clusters. That is, let's say you have a lot of experiences pertaining to water, to swimming, to drinking, to, I don't know, like, and more particularly within, you know, information clustering around the concept of a lake, of an ocean, of a bathtub, of a shower, right? So if you think within the sort of structure of your skin having contact with water, you know, someone may come and spill water on you, your siblings or whatever, you know. So you have a lot of experiences clustered in information clustered around the notion of water. Okay, so you have this would be one shelf, let's say, or yeah, let's say it's a shelf that has to do with water. Within that shelf, you have a lot of books that have to do with more specific complexes within water. So let's say a lake, your experience with lake, and so on and so forth. The shelf would represent, in the Jungian terminology, right? The shelf would represent an archetype. It would structure complexes, in this case the books, and the information within the complexes along certain trajectories that they can unfold in. The archetype has many other functions, as we discussed in other videos, and I'll get to that in a minute. The books themselves, the complexes, are independent, right? So independent of, I'll get to that in a second. They're independent in the way that they're not determined by the archetype in terms of what's inside them, right? The content of the book isn't determined by the archetype. The archetype doesn't go and say, oh yeah, but your image of water must be related to to the womb. You know, it doesn't do that. The archetype just functions as a gravitational core, attracting or structuring certain experiences along certain trajectories so that they're grouped together, let's say, and then linked by a certain energetic core, we may say. And we'll get to that in a second. I'll say a couple words about it, but I did talk about that in other videos in more detail, also about complex theory. But it's important to sort of reiterate that, because we need to know that in order to then understand what exactly sort of how debt plays a role in this conundrum or in this structure. Okay, so you have the books that represent complexes, and the books have content. The complexes have content. They're made up of the type of, and here actual experiences come in for the first time. The rest is structural units, but experiences, so the type of stuff that you actually encounter in everyday life, comes in only now. And that is, you may have almost drowned as a child, right? And that is sort of one chapter in a book, let's say, right? And you may really enjoy water, right? The holy water. You may really enjoy drinking it. But you may, sometime in your life, you may have been on a hike and you drank from sort of a spring, and there was something bad in the spring, and you had terrible gut ache for like a week, and you were in hospital or whatever. So that may be an association with water, a traumatic one. But then you may have also beautiful associations, like you had a lake in your backyard when you grew up as a child, and you were bathing in that lake every day, and it was so. And one of your first memories is how refreshing that felt, or maybe your parents would take a bath with you every night as a child, and you just love that, and that's sort of one chapter. And so all this different information is compiled within these volumes and volumes of books, right? And now we can talk about the archetype for a minute. the archetype simply draws in sort of the same kind of information within the same trajectories. It's quite apparent. I mean, if we think about this in terms of neuroscience, in order to make sense of the world, you need to have some kind of way to approach the world. You can't just approach the world empty, because then you wouldn't be able to perceive anything. In order to make up a judgment of what you see, to determine this is a mouse, this is a tree, this is a computer, this is a glass with water, this is a shower. In order to do that, you need to have a way of processing, a way of interpreting the processed stimuli that meet your retina, if you will, and then are processed in your visual cortex. Because information doesn't present itself as itself, it presents itself rather as low resolution features, right? It's like edges, lines, and shadows, and light differences, and then their configuration, their relation, angles, and then you can slowly start to form an image of that sort of bottom-up processing. Like there's no top-down process. And yes, and that there's an interference at some moment in time when the processing hierarchy goes up high enough. Then a hypothesis may be formed by the hypothalamus to say, okay, well, this may be that, right? And then you can test that by interacting with it in a certain way, clicking on it and seeing if that works. And then that will consolidate the hypothesis and ultimately lead to a percept. Well, the percept comes much earlier, but it'll ultimately validate your percept and make that sort of connection, that weight between the different units, which are the neurons in your brain, stronger. So in the end, you'll be able to recognize this object quicker. Okay, so, right, very fundamentally, if you want but then the archetypes, what they do is they cluster the same type of objects around that sort of gravitational core that is historically, let's say in the first instance, it's historically present throughout being human over time. And if you want to know more about the archetypes, check out my videos. If you want me to say more about it, leave a comment. I'm happy to clarify certain points, but to just brush over it, there's this historical element to the archetype where you have essentially situations that humans have always encountered in their interpretation of their meaning to us, sort of encoded as gravitational centers around which information then clusters. So basically water has had a very specific set of meanings throughout our life, right? It's been threatening, it's been nourishing, right? So the two poles of water, it's been associated with the uterus, with birth, with motherhood, then with, again, baptizing and so on. So there's been this cluster of symbolism that has formed from, or arisen from these concrete human encounters with water over a very long period of time. And if we talk about the archetypal symbolism, then we have this imagery and these rituals that are formed. If we talk about the archetype, we have this core, this how do I cluster complexes around the same kind of things, right, in a way. So the archetype in that way is independent from my own experience. It's there, but it's also meaningless. There's nothing to it. It's simply a gravitational core. It's simply, if you will, mass, right? But there's nothing to it. There's no content to it. The content arises from my own encounter with the world. And now here comes the logic of death. If I encounter something in the world, if I build, let's say, complexes and their content, the information within them, I do not build them sort of independently again. It's not that I go out into the world and I create my own story. That's the vision of the ego. The vision of the ego is that I can independently form an interpretation, a judgment devoid of judgment, if you will, right? It's like I cannot go out and simply say I am a sailor if I've never sailed. Indeed, I need encounters with. That's psychotic, right? Like there's a certain split from reality if that's what happens, right? Because you're not that, yet that is precisely what the ego continuously attempts to do. It attempts to interpret, it lays on top of the structure of complex and archetype in the unconscious, personal and collective, and simply says, yeah, but actually, here's the story that I'm going out and telling other people. Consulting is this amazing thing where you travel around the world and you simply, you just solve the world's most pressing problems, and but the reality, it's different. It's lurking right below, right? It's different, and so precisely what happens then is that in the formation of the complexes, there's always another involved, and that may be a certain place, a certain time, a certain smell, or most often people. And that arises in precisely this interception of two lines. So if there's one person and their linearity, their history, their time, and another person, if they're incepting, like me and my wife, we're intercepting, and here in this precise moment where we cross, a debt is established. Right? I call this moment sort of positive judgment because it's a moment in which we determine what it means to eat ice cream, let's say. Right? Like the formation of the memory of ice cream is in that moment determined by the fact that we enjoy it together, we have fun, we form that emotion, and it's forever linked and entangled with that person, right? You know this in particularly strong situations when you have a lover and you have their smell so deeply ingrained in your brain that you cannot smell it again on anyone else, in the worst instance, or the smell of a certain laundry detergent even, it's like that they always used to use on their bed sheets or whatever. Because of that deep entanglement, you can it's always that person that it comes up in your mind when you have that smell, encounter that smell again. And so this logic, or this idea of debt, now arises in saying that you owe that person something, and that is, you owe that person the interpretation of the stimulus. So the interpretation of the specific information within the complex is owed to that person. And here's why. This is really interesting. Let's for example say you have an encounter that is very forming about ice cream, right? You have someone that you fell deeply in love with in the moment you ate ice cream with them, and that was your first kiss or something like that. So ice cream forever is sort of, as it were, embroidered in your brain, right? If you will. So you owe a deep debt to them. And now you don't see them for 5 years. And forever when you eat ice cream, you always think of this moment, every time this emotion arises in you, this emotion of deep love and affection. Now, for you, this special moment is shared. It's reciprocal, right? You knew that person was going to love you. That person had to love you, but then objective circumstances gave rise to the fact that they had to leave, they had to go away. It's just they couldn't stay with you, and and so your love never worked out the way it was supposed to, and so on. Okay. Now you meet that person again 10 years later. For 10 years, every time you've eaten ice cream, that interpretation of the information that is indebted to that other person has been solidified, crystallized, as I say. So because there was no encounter between you and the other person, you could always solidify your individual interpretation of that moment. For you, that is truth. That is what you know is true. Okay? Now you meet that person, you find out that kiss was actually meaningless for them. They were in love with someone else. They're happily married. They have 4 kids, and they don't care about you. Okay, what happens now is sort of the floor is sort of pulled away under your feet, right? You fall, and you fall all the way down to hell. Now, what actually happened is that you owed a debt to that person, and it was repaid in that moment, in the moment of negative judgment, as I say. So positive judgment installed that index into your linearity. it essentially said, here, I scream and kiss, forever entangled with the idea that you think, or I think, that you have loved me forever. That is a big part of my self-image. So of the story I tell about myself, of my ego. And since I never encounter that person again, this illusion, this fantasy can continue to grow. Now, as soon as I encounter someone, or as soon as I encounter this person again, and they tell me the opposite was true, this specific element within the linearity of the ego is ruptured, it's crushed. And what arises as a consequence is a gap. Suddenly, one of the fundamental assumptions about myself and about the history, my interpretation of the history of myself, leaves, right? It disappears. And now, the important thing here is that the complex, as I said earlier, remains independent. It remains independent of you and autonomous. What this means is that you cannot control the destiny of the actual meaning of this complex. Ice cream, kiss, love, whatever. Although you pretend to interpret it. That is, your ego pretends to have the control over the specific element, over the specific piece of information within this complex, and so on. And that's precisely the fictionality, the illusion of the ego's control, the fictionality of the ego, right? Now, the power over the development of that specific aspect, that specific piece of information, lays with the person that indexed this positive judgment into your linearity. And again, as we said in other videos, I can link it here, about the complexes, the significance or the strength of the rupture, the fundamental, it depends on how fundamental that complex and the information, the specific information that is targeted, was to the construction of your own self-image, so to the construction of the linearity of your ego, right? We're always talking, what is at stake or what is threatened is the linearity, the narration, the narrative body your ego creates on top of the sort of the reality of these complexes, in the personal and collective unconscious. Well, collective unconscious only by virtue of the archetype that sort of create the trajectories for the complexes to sort of situate themselves. So, what is at stake in the end is the stability of your own story about yourself to yourself and then via the persona to others. So the point is that not only do you owe a debt to that other person, but the other person also owes a debt to you because you have co-created that moment. Like in the other person's linearity, you are the origin, the instantiator, the source of ice cream and kiss association. But for that person, this information, this complex, played no role in the construction of the linearity of the ego. For you, it did. And so their power over your sort of the stability of your ego is much greater. And now, when we talk about sort of defense mechanisms, what we actually sort of mean is the ego's attempt to defend its stability, right? The idea that you don't want anyone else to have that power over you. You don't want anyone else to have any power over the destiny of what you think you are. You want to, or the ego wants to retain that power. And it does everything to shut that out. But the reality is that the ego itself, as we've discussed in multiple instances, is nothing but the reflex to create this linearity, this narrative structure. It has no actual substance and no content. And without content, there's no reality to it either. And so the ego has this weird dependence on these complexes and on this sort of underlying unconscious structure. Unconscious in this case only referring to the difference between ego and non-ego. And again, these complexes, this unconscious structure then is deeply entangled with everyone else. And so the reality here really is that there is nothing that belongs to you beneath the fictional interpretation, sort of the fictional linearity that the ego creates as an interpretation of that which doesn't belong to you. And this is, I think, I think this is indicated in Jung. I don't think this is necessarily, he doesn't necessarily drive that point home or ponder on it for too long. So a lot of this is probably my own interpretation of it. But I think it's quite fundamental, because if you think about it, really what it means is that what you think you are has nothing to do with you yourself as a locus of. It really prompts us to think about, where am I? What am I? And it really suggests here that I'm spread all over the world. I'm entangled and sort of determined by everything that I have encountered throughout my own life. And it really prompts us to think that we should be really careful what we do, who we do it with, and how we structure that within our own subjectivity, right? Because in the end, that is exactly what you are. You cannot get rid of those moments. If you have specifically very strong memories, very strong encounters, those will continue to exist even if you attempt to shut them off. So first of all, what it also means is that if we look around ourselves, that's what we are. And if we have these ideas that we can just break off with the past and move away from our homes and just leave our past and our parents and everything behind, that's an illusion. We can't do that. It doesn't work. You can never leave anything behind. You can repress it, but you can never close a chapter. You can close the book. You can finish reading it, but it will be forever on your shelf. And that shelf will forever remain not the property of you, but the property of those actors within the books. And if those actors decide to come up again and rise against you, let's say, then the stability of your ego may be threatened. And in the second instance, however, it does prompt a very, very interesting path towards interaction with yourself, which is simply open the books that are sort of represent your complexes and read them. Find out what they are, who they are, what they do, and find out what's at the bottom of them. That is the archetypes, right? Find out what they are through the lens of the archetypes. I think one quite important aspect is that each rupture, so each punctuation of the ego in its linearity, in the end must originate somewhere. So each time you feel like something has punctured your body, something has done something physical to you, let's say, but it's psychological, right? So someone says something and you feel hurt. Carefully think about, like, what did this arise from? Where did this come from? What is the network that this is entangled with? What does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with anyone else? What's the origin of this? And then the purpose is not some kind of cognitive behavioral therapy thing that you want to sort of shut off being emotional. But the idea really is that you want to be emotional for the sake of discovering what it is that underlies your own interpretation of your own reality, i.e. the ego. I think that's really interesting and important. It's a really interesting task to do. And then you can continue asking yourself, how has this situation been penetrated throughout the history of humankind, i.e. what's the archetype that's underlying it? And what's the sort of the symbols and mythology and stories and all that that's sort of clustering around that archetype over time. And then you get into the relevance of literature, the relevance of reading, the relevance of studying art, the relevance of studying, in general, the humanities, except philosophy. Philosophy is also very relevant, but not for this component, which is precisely that in this perspective, right, there's other relevances, but in this perspective, it's precisely this, you learn about the eternal drama of being human, if you will, which is always the same. It's always the same. In the end, like, yeah, we have our particularities, and it's, I live here and you live there, and, whatever, I'm white and you're whatever. It doesn't matter. In the end, it's all the human history that we share. And, just because someone else has lived 2,000 years ago doesn't mean that the history they share is different from mine. It doesn't mean, I'm their survivor in a way. I survived them, and I'm just continuing what they've done all along. And so I think that's quite an interesting perspective. It justifies the study to a large extent of historical and fictional documents. Fiction is the same thing. I mean, what is fiction if not simply a documentation of the human struggle, even in its fantastic imaginations? But the ego is just the same. It's also just fantastic imaginations. I mean, I'm not what the hell I'm telling everyone I am, and I don't even know what I am, and you don't know who you are, and so fiction and fantasy and reality, I mean, I think it's pretty obsessional to claim that you know reality. It's very, I don't know, it's pretty, there's something about it that evokes problems of control and so on. So anyway, so that plays a fundamental role, and that for me is an entry point into interpersonal communication, interpersonal interaction, because now if someone triggers something in you, you have an opening, not only to delve into yourself, but you have to, in order to delve into yourself, you have to delve into the other. You have no choice, because you are essentially spread out across the world. And so you have to go into the world in order to return to yourself. I think this is one of the fundamental messages that Jung gives us, that you are to be found in everything else by virtue of you being indebted to everything else present and to everything else that has ever been present throughout the history of humankind via the archetypes. And this is precisely where I think he prompts us to look for ourselves, but then also for our position within the human context. Thank you very much for watching the video. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions, and if you like this channel and the content, please consider to subscribe, hit the like button, and recommend it to your friends and family. Thank you.